cilvēks, kura sirdi, mēs tā vismaz sākumā piesakām ar divām viņa tēzēm. Viena ir tāda, ka sievietes tiesības kontrolēt savu ķermeni nekad nedrīkst uzskatīt par prioritāti salīdzinājumā ar dzīvību viņas dzemdē. Tas ir viens. Un otrs, cilvēku verdzība mūsdienās ir izplatītāka nekā pilsoņu kara laikā 19. gadsimta beigās. Tikai mēs par to iespējams nenojaušam. Vēlos stādīt jums priekšā Kristīgo ārstu un zobārstu asociācijas vecāko viceprezidentu bioētikas un sabiedriskās politikas jautājumos. Pēdējos 15 gadus Džefrijs ir veltījis, lai apkarotu cilvēku tirdzniecību. 2008. gadā doktors Barrows ir nodibinājis organizāciju Gracehaven, kas palīdz nepilngadīgajiem seksuālās tirdzniecības upuriem Ohio štatā. Un 2020. gadā publicējis noveli ar nosaukumu Atrodot brīvību, kurā realistiski attēlota bērnu seksuālā tirdzniecība ASV. Mums ir pieslēdzies doktors Džefrijs Barrows, un ar aplausiem viņu sagaidām.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to this group. I am quite honored. I am now standing in a hotel room in Dallas, Texas, because I'm attending a meeting of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists. My background is that I am an OB/GYN physician. I currently work at the Christian Medical Dental Association of the United States. I am the person that oversees all our public policy work as well as our advocacy. So the title of what I'm going to talk about today is, as you can see on the PowerPoint, is life. What's it worth? And what I really want to delve into today is how people arrive at their opinion or decision as to what life is worth. And in doing so, I also want to talk about the basis for why people have differing opinions as to exactly what life is worth. And the purpose in doing this is to help all of us to speak to those who do not agree with us. We have major issues with that here in the United States, and I'm sure you do as well there in Europe and Latvia. Learning objectives that I have for this is for all of you to recognize the foundational importance of worldview as we talk about various issues such as the value of human life and in other ethical issues in medicine. Secondly, I want to frame the value of life argument around foundational values. And I'll talk more a little bit about what I mean about when I say foundational values. And thirdly, I want to help each of us to defend the sanctity of human life by engaging in what I call foundational arguments. Now, the way that I see things or conceptualize our thinking is in three different levels. And I use the analogy of a building that has 2 stories above the ground and then 1 story beneath the ground. And each of those levels represents a type of thinking. And starting at the top floor, this is where the vast majority of us engage in everyday thinking, our normal conversations, our day-to-day activities, and occasionally deep thought. And this is also where if we get in an argument or a disagreement with someone else, this is the level where we're doing that. We're not thinking any deeper level. We're just at that everyday thinking level. But beneath that second floor, on the ground floor, is what I have called principled thinking. And by that, I mean that the thinking that we do, the basis, our principles, the basis for us living our lives. We don't often think about these principles. They're in the background, but they are ruling the way that we live our lives. And there are two things that form the principles that we live by. The first is our experience, the way we were raised, perhaps what church we were raised in, or whatever faith we were raised in. The impact of our family and our friends, our experience will help us to form the principles that we typically live our life by. But the second, which is the most important thing that forms our principles, is our presuppositions, our basic beliefs, the way we see the world, and what we call our worldview. And that is down in the underground, the foundation. Now, we don't often think of this at a conscious level, but these are in the background, our beliefs, our presuppositions, and our worldview. So we have three levels of thinking. The top floor is where we spend most of our time in our normal day-to-day conversations, our day-to-day activities, and where you are right now. But supporting that and driving into that is the principles that we live by and our foundational thinking. Both of these are typically in the background. Now, I think all of us want to achieve what I call a level of coherence and integrity in our lives. And in order to do that, we have to form our thinking in a way that begins at the foundational level. In other words, we have to have our beliefs and our presuppositions form the principles that we're going to live by, which then inform our day-to-day thinking. This is critical. And when this happens, when our basic presuppositions, our basic beliefs form the principles that we live our lives by, and we live them out at that top level, we are going to live a coherent life with integrity. But I will say to you, in all honesty, that I did not achieve this level of coherence in my life until I was in my 40s. If you had asked me, Jeff, are you living according to your presuppositions and your beliefs? I would have said, yes, I am. But it wasn't until certain instances that came up and challenged me that I realized that I wasn't doing that. And I'll give you an example. When I was in practice as an OBGYN, I had a Christian couple that I had put through a workup for infertility. And unfortunately, we could not find the cause of their infertility. So they came in to me as a couple, and they said to me, Dr. Barrows, we want to ask you as a Christian, what do you think about in vitro fertilization? And it was at that moment, when I was in my late 30s, I'd been in practice for maybe 10 years, that I realized I had not stopped and taken the time to think deeply about the Christian ramifications of in vitro fertilization. I was operating out of the principle of autonomy, that if it could be done, it should be done. And I failed that Christian couple. And that's because I had not allowed my basic beliefs and presuppositions to question some of the principles that I was utilizing as I practiced OBGYN. So this is a lifelong process that I think many of us are still in the midst of going through. And it typically later in life before you reach the level where you achieve coherence and integrity all through these levels. Now, often what happens is what happened with me in terms of the in vitro fertilization question, is that we have a break, we have a separation between our principles that we're living our life by and our beliefs and presuppositions. We may not recognize that that's there, or there are other times that we recognize that we are in disagreement with the church or the Bible. And this is the reason that many Christians will, for instance, talk about the fact that they support abortion in certain instances. For a long time, I didn't understand that. Why is that? Why would Christians who believed that the Bible was true still adopt the principle that abortion is fine within certain circumstances? And the reason for this is that they have cut themselves off from their beliefs and presuppositions. They don't want to delve down into that area because they want to have a predetermined principle that they have come up with in their life experience. For example, a woman may have had an unwanted pregnancy as a young person, and it was very difficult for them, and they ended up having to have an abortion. That person would be very, very hesitant to dive down into their beliefs and presuppositions to say that what she went through was wrong. So the easier alternative is to rationalize their actions and adopt a belief that in certain instances, for example, abortion is correct. Now, I've talked a little bit about the fact that our basic beliefs and our basic presuppositions form our worldview. And every worldview can be reduced down to two foundational worldviews: either a created worldview or an accidental worldview. And in the created worldview, of course, there is a creator, a designer of the universe, a supernatural being that has made all of us. And in that worldview, there are certain characteristics that we can see and to identify. First, the world will have a preset structure. That structure may differ depending upon the religion, but all religions recognize that the world we live in has a structure that has been there from the beginning. It was put in place by the Creator. And secondly, the world has built-in values that are again put in place by the Creator. And let me give you an example I often use when I'm talking about this topic. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with cars or probably car owners. And I know that when I buy a car, I want the car to last as long as possible. And we all recognize that a car is designed by an engineer, and it is designed to be utilized in a certain way with a certain maintenance to it. But if I adopt, for instance, and here's the point I want to make, that when we go against preset structure or built-in values, that brings harm to us as individuals. So if I am a car owner and I decide I want a car to last for several 100,000 miles, but in the midst of that, I believe in a conspiracy that oil companies are just out to make money, that cars don't really need oil. So I ignore all the instructions to add oil to the car engine. Well, if you're a car owner, you recognize that in time, what's going to happen is that car engine will stop running. And it's because I did not recognize the built-in structure and the built-in values of that engine. And the same is true about our bodies within this created worldview. We recognize that our bodies are designed in a certain way to be utilized in a certain way. And when we go against that design, it brings harm to our bodies. And this is an interesting and I think very helpful way of framing the whole concept of sin, for example, in homosexual activity. When we recognize that we are not designed for homosexual activity, then when we engage in that and harm comes, it is not necessarily because God is angry at us. In fact, my personal belief is that God is saying to us in the Bible, which is our owner's manual, that do not engage in homosexual activity because I didn't design you for homosexual activity. And if you do, you will bring harm to yourself. So that's very helpful for us to frame many of the issues that we deal with. So in the created worldview, going against those preset structure and preset values that are built into the creation automatically brings harm to us as an individual. And finally, if we want to thrive and flourish in this created worldview, the way to do that is by conforming ourselves to that structure and values, submitting ourselves to God, because that is the way we can flourish and we can minimize the harm that will come to us. That is the basis of the created worldview. And all created worldviews will have these 4 different characteristics. But these are very different than the accidental worldview. The accidental worldview, as the name implies, says that the universe came into being by accident, solely by accident. There is no supernatural being. There is no designer. There is no creator. It just all happened just purely by chance. Therefore, there cannot be any inherent or absolute values in the world. There may be a structure in the world, but that structure came into being solely by accident. It was not designed. It was not put into place for a purpose. And there are no values. All values are relative in this accidental worldview because the world consists solely of raw material, atoms and molecules that by chance have come together through the process of evolution to allow us to come into being. Very different than the created worldview. Therefore, the goal to flourish in the accidental worldview is to use the raw material that we've been given to whatever degree we can to accumulate power and ability to use that raw material to create the life that I want. And very briefly, probably the greatest example of this happening is within what we call the transgender tsunami. Those believe that if I, as an individual, think that I am a woman in a man's body, I can change the raw material of my body to adopt to what I sense inside that I am. And that's perfectly logical to them. And so one of the reasons that I want to spend so much time talking about this is so that we can see the logic behind the thinking that is different than our own. So in essence, these two worldviews can be condensed down. In the created worldview, we see and say that God will do something or has done something, that we are to conform to God's will. But in the accidental worldview, there is no God, and it is all up to me. In essence, I become God. And what I have found is that the vast majority of people are somewhere in between. They may, in part of their life, adopt the tenets of a particular faith, but in other parts of their life, they want to maintain control and really live according to the accidental worldview. Because we need to recognize that the accidental worldview has a very strong draw, and that is that I can be in control of my life. Whereas the created worldview, if we adhere to that completely, we have to conform ourselves. We have to submit ourselves to what God wants. So, the other important point to make here is that it is at an individual level that we make this decision. We can't tell anyone else what to believe. We can't make anybody else believe either the created or the accidental worldview. They have to adopt that themselves. And again, I believe there is a process to this. I think that there are many people that go through a stage where, as James says in the first chapter, that they are tossed back and forth by waves of indecision because they're in the middle between a created or accidental worldview where part of them wants to submit to God, but parts of them want to stay in control themselves. And of course, James tells us that we have to get rid of that double-mindedness that can be found here in the middle between two different ways of looking at the world. So, worldview matters. It matters a great deal. And I recommend, especially to our students and residents here in the United States, that they invest time in developing their worldview and especially understanding how their worldview impacts the various decisions that they are going to make in medicine throughout their career. And not wait, like I did, until I was in my 40s before I had full coherence between my worldview, my principles, and my top-level everyday thinking. So, with that, I have been asked to address the question, what is life worth? Or the value of human life? Well, if we try and decide which level are we talking about when we ask that question, many of you might say, well, this is a foundational question. And in some ways it is, but it is not part of our basic beliefs and our basic presuppositions. In fact, this is a principle. It is a principle that we decide ourselves based on either our experience or our worldview. And that's why we have so much disagreement, at least here in the United States, between different people as to what the value of human life truly is. what I would like to do is to really spend some time, and if we are going to be speaking to people who have disagreement with us on the value of human life, we have to move from that principle level of thinking down to the foundation level of thinking if we're going to make any progress. That's an important point to understand, hopefully, from my talk today. So let's look again at the accidental worldview. Again, the universe came into being by accident. There are no inherent or absolute values in the world. The world consists solely of raw material, and the goals of humans is to use this raw material to create the life they want. Someone coming out of that worldview who truly believes those things as their basic beliefs and basic presuppositions is going to have a very different value for human life than those of us who are Christians. And basically, you can say that their view of the value of human life is going to be relative. It's going to depend on things. It's going to depend on context and other things, as I'll share in a minute. It will not be absolute. In fact, I would point out that for them, having an absolute value of human life is illogical. They don't understand that. It does not make sense to them. How can life have an absolute value when all we are is atoms and molecules that have come together by a random process to become humans? It is illogical from someone who is truly adopting an accidental worldview. Probably the greatest example that we have in the United States of a philosopher that adopts this is Dr. Peter Singer, who is a professor of philosophy at Princeton. And Dr. Singer has fully adopted the view that human life is solely based on function. It depends on the cognitive ability of the being, their ability to take care of themselves, to protect themselves. And he is one of the few that has maintained a coherence all the way through his levels of thinking, which is why he believes that there are certain animals after birth who are able to take care of themselves and able to function fully that have greater value than human babies who are completely dependent upon their mothers and fathers. He views certain animals like porpoises and dolphins of greater value than a human baby. And it has all other ramifications. And another common example is the pregnant woman who sees this unborn child within her as raw material. It is in her body. She has the autonomy, the authority over that unborn child. Therefore, the value of life of that unborn child is dependent upon whether or not she wants that child. Now, we've all heard those arguments before. My point today is to understand them within the accidental worldview and to recognize that that is logical. That's where they are coming from. And we can take a step back and say, oh, I understand. This is what you truly believe. And trying to argue with them at that principle level of thinking is going to be a waste of time. So, lots of different things will come into play in terms of the relative value of human life. There are certain groups within our culture that will adopt the view that life has a certain value. The context Again, within the pregnancy, if a woman wants the pregnancy, then the baby has untold value. But if she doesn't want the baby, if she didn't want to become pregnant, that unborn child has no value whatsoever. It is simply a collection of atoms and molecules, and she should, in her view, be allowed to end that pregnancy. Culture is another one. And the example that I often use is the example of Down's syndrome. In Down syndrome, more and more prenatal testing is being done so that the diagnosis can be made of Down syndrome, and unfortunately, the baby aborted. But here in America, we have certain Native American tribes that put high value on babies that have Down syndrome because they have that property of being very joyful and bringing happiness and joy to those around them. So depends totally on the culture. And so again, you can get caught into this middle where people will, for instance, say that they are Christians, say that they believe the Bible, but when it comes to abortion, they really tend more on the accidental worldview side and leave it up to their autonomy as they are in control, and they will be in the middle. And another way of looking at this, using my analogy of the different levels of thinking, they will cut themselves off from their beliefs and presuppositions and adopt a view, for instance, of life that is relative, not absolute. Now, that's very different than those of us who adopt a created worldview, where again, the world has a preset structure, built-in values, and going against those values brings harm to the individual, and the goal of flourishing is to conform or submit ourselves to that structure and values. Again, a very different way of looking at the world. And those who have a created worldview and allow that worldview to form the principles that they live by, they will have an absolute view of the value of human life. It will not be relative, dependent upon the situation. It will not depend on the culture. It will have no other factors. It will simply depend on the value of that religion. It may differ between religions. We see that it doesn't differ a great deal, but within that religion, the value of human life is absolute. And I know you've had a talk on the sanctity of human life. And so in the Christian worldview, the most common verse that we take our view of what the value of human life is from Genesis 1:27, where God tells us that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And theologians have wrestled for millennia as to what it means to be created in the image of God. But the important point for our benefit is that because we are created in God's image, we have an absolute value that is inestimable. It cannot be estimated. The other thing that we see in this verse that I don't have time to go into is that we are created male and female. Therefore, the transgender ideology is not something that a Christian can, with all integrity, adopt. So, when we begin with the Christian worldview as our foundational thinking, and then we look and try and answer the question of what is the value of human life, or as the title of my talk says, what is a human life worth? We can recognize that the principle comes out of being created in God's image, and that biblical principle then is translated as the sanctity of human life. There is a holiness to human life. It is absolute. It is not dependent. It is not relative. So, when we look at unborn life, for instance, we hold as Christians that life begins at fertilization. There is no possibility of valuing that life on the basis of function as Peter Singer does at Princeton. That is anathema to us as Christians. That is the wrong way of dealing with it. Should be no requirement for feeling pain or viability, as we often see in certain laws here in the United States. Anytime there is an intervention in pregnancy to terminate that pregnancy, that ends a human life, plain and simple. Which is why also that Christians who are living a coherent life and they are allowing that worldview of being created in God's image to form the principles that they live by, recognize that termination, even in the cases of rape and incest, are wrong. Because in the cases of rape and incest, as horrific and terrible as they are, you are ending a human life that has untold value. And secondly, that life is innocent. That life did not cause the rape. That life did not cause the incest. So we oppose abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. Again, because the value of human life is immeasurable. So, to those with the accidental worldview, abortion is acceptable, and I will say again, even logical. Again, I do not agree, but it is logical. So if we're going to speak to those who disagree with us on the important issues such as abortion or assisted suicide, we have to do it at the worldview level. We cannot do it at the ground floor, the principle level. We only have arguments and they do not get anywhere. We need to do it at the worldview level. And we do that through questions, basic questions like, when do you believe life begins? So we gently interrogate the other person. What are your beliefs that lead you to that particular view? And I don't have time to go into that a lot. We can talk more about that during the question and answer. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis from his book, The Weight of Glory. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is as ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. And I would add to this that it is immortals that we disagree with as well. Now, next, I've focused most of my time and attention on the beginning, an unborn life, on abortion. But another very important issue we're facing in the United States is the end of life. And there are many states adopting here in the U.S. laws that legalize assisted suicide. We have not yet reached the point where we have legalized euthanasia, but I know that is coming. And again, as Christians, we believe we are created beings. We do not belong to ourselves. So that is not, we do not have the authority to decide when our life ends. Whereas someone who has the accidental worldview, it is perfectly logical for them to say, my life is up to me. I have the right to end it when I want to, Therefore, do not stop me from prematurely ending my life. But we as Christians have to see assisted suicide and euthanasia as evil again, because we do not belong to ourselves. We are created. And as created beings, we are under the authority of our Creator. So, as I get closer to the end, I just want to bring up what happens when the value of life becomes relative. And many of you, and I'm sure most of you, are aware of this, but 73 million unborn babies are lost every year. A tremendous tragedy. 73 million babies lost every year, which is, I looked it up online, 40 times the population of Latvia. Every single year. It's actually greater than the population of 215 countries across the world. I mentioned how Down syndrome is valued by Native Americans and certain tribes, but they no longer exist in Iceland because all of the Down's babies in Iceland are diagnosed during the pregnancy and terminated. So my understanding is that there are no Down's children at all in the country of Iceland, which is a tragedy. We look at the issue at the end of life. Over 20,000 elderly and disabled end their lives prematurely every single year. Many of them are coerced into this by family members or insurance companies or governments that don't want to expend the money, the extra money, to take care of these people as they get to the end of their lives. I spent 15 years of my career fighting human trafficking. And I know that there are millions of people being trafficked or exploited around the world. So next to death at the beginning or the end, in my mind, one of the worst things that can happen to human beings as we degrade the value of human life is to exploit other human beings. And tens of millions of people around the world are being exploited in various ways, either through forced marriage, forced labor, or forced prostitution or sexual exploitation. And this is the most recent numbers from the International Labor Organization and the Walk Free Foundation, just out of 2022. And I do want to point out that there's been an increase, and it's continually rising in frequency. From 2016 to 2021, there's been an increase of several million, and the vast majority of that increase is not been through large corporations or governments. It's through small entities or individuals made up of people who are exploiting another human being. So we have, with this devaluation of life, an increase in the number of people that are being exploited by another human being because they see the value of life as relative. So how should we as Christians respond? Well, I think first, as I've kind of said throughout this talk, that we have to stand firm in our beliefs and in our worldview. We have to make sure that our beliefs and our worldview are forming the principles that we are living our life by, that we are practicing medicine by, that then come out at that top level of our thinking. We need to develop defenses for our worldview and our beliefs. That's the whole area of apologetics that I don't have time to get into, but there are excellent defenses to show that we live in a created worldview. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming if someone is willing to look at it. But we can't stop there. We need to advocate for the vulnerable among us. And that's the way I look at our work at the Christian Medical Dental Association in the United States. I look at our work as advocating and protecting the vulnerable. There are several verses that I could use and go to, but one of my favorites is this one out of Psalms 82, 3 and 4, where God is giving us this command: give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. I don't see any groups that raise higher than unborn children that are being aborted and terminated every single day, that have no voice and no one speaking for them. For those at the end of their life who are weak and unable to really speak in defense for their own desire to live, because we find that quite often those that are ending their life prematurely are doing it again because they feel a pressure from their family. And certainly another group is the young people. I don't have time to get into it, but the young people that are falling prey to transgender ideology, especially here in the United States, and being taken through the process of being given hormones and undergoing surgeries, simply because those that push that ideology believe that we are raw material, atoms and molecules, and we have the right to change our bodies in whatever way that we desire, rather than seeing us correctly as created beings that were created in a certain way for a certain function. So with that, I will conclude and start the time for questions.
I have a few questions for you. So let's start with what do you think of the recent U.S. court ruling that struck down the constitutional right to abortion that had been in place since 1973?
Well, of course, you're talking about what we call the Dobbs decision. Overall, we were very pleased. I happened to be privileged to be able to go to the steps of our Supreme Court on the day that hearing took place on December the 1st in 2022. And we were pleased with how the court ruled. Basically, what it did is it took away, as you mentioned, the quote, legal right for abortion and left it up to the states. So while there was initially great pleasure among us in the pro-life sector, we do recognize and have seen since that time that there have been many other battles at the state level. And frankly, we have lost many of those battles. I will be honest and transparent with all of you to say that there are states, including my home state of Ohio, that have passed amendments that have opened the access to abortion farther open than what Roe v. Wade had. So it's been a mixture. While we were very excited about the initial decision, since that time we have been certainly disappointed and frustrated by the pro-abortion victories that have occurred in many states around our country. So it's with sadness that we see this happening, and it's been kind of a mixed picture since that decision.
Thank you. What should we do if the doctor makes you choose between the baby, between the life of the baby or life of the mother? Whose life is of bigger value?
Well, I can say that as an OBGYN, that decision is very rare. That is truly very rare. It does happen. I had it happen to me during my practice. I would say one of the more common causes behind that is a woman who is, say, 21, 22 weeks along in her pregnancy, and she develops a particularly severe form of what we call preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnancy. And what I recommend is that the woman, if it is determined that the pregnancy must end, my recommendation is that it should end through the instigation of premature labor. Because first of all, it gives, even if there's only a very slight possibility of that baby surviving, it allows that baby that option. Secondly, it's much better for the mother, for her, if that baby does not survive the labor and the birth, to be able to hold that baby. Versus if she undergoes an abortion, which will typically, there's several types, but it might end up in the baby's body being destroyed, that mother will not have the ability to mourn that pregnancy or that baby. And so in the rare instance where a woman's physical life is in danger, I do recommend premature induction of labor and using what we call perinatal hospice to try and do what we can for that baby, but recognize that even that obviously the mother's life is what must be saved.
Thank you. That's definitely a tough question, so thank you for the answer. Another one, I wouldn't say much easier. What is your opinion on artificial insemination and surrogacy and sperm donors, considering that God, at the end of the day, is the one who can only give life? So how and does he accept it?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. And this was another question that really gets to what I'm trying to get to in the talk, in that if you had asked me that question about artificial insemination, because those are three different things. Artificial insemination, if you'd asked me when I was in my 30s, I would have said, it's not a problem. If we can help a woman get pregnant and her husband is completely infertile and azoospermic, it's called, what's the problem with it? But I had not thought deeply about that. And having now, since that time, thought deeply and biblically, according to my biblical worldview, I recognize that especially when you take into account that child that results and what happens, that artificial insemination by donor is not all that healthy. I do not agree with it. I would not engage in it. Because you don't know who the father is. And that child, and we've learned this by interviewing children of artificial insemination, they feel and they suffer emotionally without knowing who their father is. And so bringing a child into the world that way, I believe, is not what God's plan is. Second, surrogacy. Surrogacy is, for the most part, unbiblical. When I say for the most part, there are extremely narrow exceptions, and they don't happen very often. But I'll give you an example. If a couple has undergone in vitro fertilization and they have frozen embryos, which I am opposed to. I do not believe that a Christian couple should freeze any embryos. If they're going to go through in vitro, they should implant every embryo that results from that in vitro cycle. But let's say a couple has gone through and they've frozen a couple of embryos with the plan that they were going to have another pregnancy and have those implanted at a later time. But we've had patients who have developed uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, that has required that the uterus and ovaries be removed to save her life. What do you do then with those frozen embryos? We've had, and I know of people that have patients who have had a sister step forward and say, I will carry those two babies for you. You can then raise those children as your own because they are your own. That is a very rare circumstance that I would not be opposed to surrogacy. But almost every other form of surrogacy, especially commercial surrogacy, is, I believe, unbiblical and should not be engaged in.
Okay, thank you. And for the final question for this Q&A, how can we fruitfully engage with the other worldview? How to communicate our opinions regarding, for example, transgenderism or other subjects in personal and public context?
I was hoping someone would ask that question. I think we have to, if we're going to get down to the worldview level of thinking, we have to speak in terms of beliefs. And I think that we as Christians, first of all, should adopt a winsome attitude of asking the other person, what are your beliefs? And begin to gently interrogate them. Interrogate is probably too strong a word, but question them about, well, when, for instance, if we're talking about abortion, when do you believe life begins? And I will tell you that many of the times they don't have a good answer for that. And then I would say, can I share with you my belief? My belief is that as a Christian, I am created and that I believe that life begins at fertilization. And by the way, do you know that over 95% of embryologists, the scientists that study the beginning of life, over 95%, if you ask them, when does life begin biologically, they will say at fertilization. And so it's important for us to utilize and frame our discussion in terms of beliefs by gently asking the other person their beliefs. Are they open to changing their beliefs? Because if they do change their basic beliefs and presuppositions, it will automatically change their approach and their principle in terms of the value of life. I'm not saying it's easy. It is not easy. It's difficult. It frequently will not be successful, but I personally believe that it is the only way that we will successfully make any difference in any change in the views of the other side.
Thank you. I will not let you go yet. I must compliment you. You are excellent at answering questions, so you've won a few more questions. What are the most common types of human trafficking? This is another subject of yours.
It depends on where in the world you are. In Africa and India, the most common forms of human trafficking are labor trafficking. In the United States, and I would say in the vast majority of Western Europe, where there is a lot more money, the vast majority of trafficking is sexual exploitation, both of children and of adult women. And so it doesn't mean that labor exploitation does not occur in Europe and in the United States. We see child labor in various parts and of various types here in the U.S. But the overall greatest form of trafficking in the U.S., North America, and in most of Western Europe is in fact sexual exploitation. So we unfortunately have men and women. A lot of people don't recognize that women buy sex. I didn't know that until I got into the fight, but women do buy sex. They buy sex both from other females as well as males. But by and large, the greatest number of buyers of commercial sex are men, and they're buying, unfortunately, young girls all the way up to adult girls that are being exploited in some way or another.
When you spoke to some of our organizers and you offered to speak also on the subject, you said, well, we said that it's not really actual in our country, and you said that we just don't know about it. So what would be the potential types here in Latvia or the Baltic states that you're aware of? What should we know? we still have 1.5 minutes.
I have no doubt that you have both of them. I've been to cities where city leaders said, we don't have that here. And then later the FBI finds it. It's hidden. It's difficult to find. I don't know enough about your country, Latvia, to really be able to give very specific things, but I have no doubt there is no country in the world that is free of trafficking. If you have people there that want to look and find information about it, I would go to the International Labor Organization and see what they have found about Latvia. Our State Department every year puts out a report on various countries, and Latvia will be interested there. But I have no doubt that you have both sexual and labor exploitation. I would simply ask, do you have prostitution in Latvia?
Yes, we do.
If you have prostitution, at least a large measure of that is actually some form of exploitation. Because I usually talk to groups and say, what girl at age 12 says, when I grow up, I want to be a prostitute? No girl would do that. So why are women in prostitution? They're in prostitution because they have very little other choice. And frequently there is a pimp behind that prostitute that is forcing them, threatening them in various ways to stay in prostitution, and that is sex trafficking.
Thank you for your answer. Our time is running out in the yellow and in the red. I can only say it's truly a shame that you're not here with us. I mean, for the lectures, we have free water and so otherwise, thank you very much for your insights. Applause.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for inviting me. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
And I hope we will continue this cooperation also next year. The conference is not just for this year, it will continue.